On the roof of an old house in a quiet suburb, police found two bodies, a brother and sister. They were lying, holding hands. Under them, a dark, bloody stain on the asphalt. The trial for the murder of their grandmother had already been scheduled, but the jury never heard a single word from the accused. In the early 2000s, the Sanderson family lived on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. The house was one story, with peeling white paint on the walls and an old porch, where in the summer there were two plastic chairs and a rusty table. The owner of the house was considered to be 67-year-old Mary Sanderson, a widow who lost her husband in a car accident many years ago. After the death of her daughter and son-in-law in an accident in 1998, she was left with two grandchildren in her care, twins, brother and sister, Jacob and Lily. Jacob and Lily were born with Down syndrome. Doctors warned the parents about possible health and social adaptation problems in the maternity hospital, but the parents tried to surround their children with care. After their deaths, the responsibilities fell on the shoulders of the grandmother. Mary never complained, although neighbors sometimes heard how she could not fall asleep for a long time at night. The TV was on almost until the morning. The lights in the windows were on until late. The children attended a special school in a nearby area. Teachers said that the twins were quiet, withdrawn, and rarely interacted with others. After school, the school bus brought them home, and they rarely left the area. Their grandmother was the only adult who was constantly around. The family's financial situation was modest. Social benefits, Mary's small pension, and occasional help from the church. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked, the floors creaked, but overall it was clean and tidy inside. Mary tried to keep things tidy. Everything was in its place. There was always a kettle in the kitchen and an old chest of drawers with family photos in the living room. In the summer of 2002, neighbors said the twins became even more withdrawn. They rarely went outside, although they used to like to sit on the porch or ride old bikes. The grandmother mentioned several times at a local store that the children have grown up and now they have their own secrets. No one attached much importance to these words. Police reports written after the tragedy indicated that it was during this period that the first changes in Lily and Jacob's behavior began. They began to spend more and more time together, sometimes sitting for hours in their room behind a closed door. Grandma would knock, calling them to dinner, but sometimes they would not open right away, although they had always responded quickly before. A neighbor, Mrs. Harper, once saw Lily and Jacob holding hands as they crossed the street to the bus stop. The woman later told the police that she was surprised at the time. Usually the brother and sister walked at a distance from each other. However, at the time, no one paid any attention to it. In a small town, people rarely interfered in other people's lives, and the Sanderson family was always considered quiet and poor, but prosperous. The first warning signs, as journalists would later write, were noticeable in the summer. The school psychologist's diary, a copy of which was included in the case materials, recorded that Lily had become unusually emotional, often laughing or crying for no apparent reason. Jacob, on the contrary, became even more silent. When the psychologist tried to talk to them about family, both twins avoided the topic or answered in monosyllables. Grandmother Mary, as investigators later established, did not immediately realize that something was changing in her grandchildren's behavior. She told a friend from church that the children had grown up and become independent, but at the same time, it was during this period that she began to lock the front door more often at night, which she had not done before. The interrogation reports mentioned that she once asked the priest to talk to the children about morality, but then changed her mind and did not bring them to church. The police kept recordings from neighbors. They heard music playing from an old tape recorder in the Sanderson house sometimes late into the night, although it had been quiet before. One neighbor said he saw Lily and Jacob dancing in the living room through the window. When asked why he did nothing, the man replied, "What could I do? They were just dancing." Grandma was sitting next to her, watching TV. By the fall of 2002, the twins had virtually stopped communicating with anyone outside the home. The school continued to record their rare visits, and teachers called their grandmother, who explained that the children often caught colds. In reality, as it turned out later, they were increasingly staying home without permission. One county sheriff's report noted that social services were considering inspecting the home, but were unable to make a visit before the tragedy. At that time, no one knew that it was during these months that the Sanderson family began a story that would end in blood, police reports, and local newspaper headlines. The fall of 2002 was a turning point for the Sanderson family. If at the beginning of the summer the twins still somehow participated in the life of the yard and communicated with the neighbors' children, now they withdrew more and more into themselves. The house was silent, occasionally broken by the creaking of floorboards or the sound of wind walking along the old roof. Neighbors noticed that the windows in Lily and Jacob's rooms were often closed with curtains even during the day. The investigation materials would later include notes from social workers who, based on school data, were supposed to check the children's living conditions. However, the visit never took place. The family was not on the high-risk list, and there were not enough resources for the inspection. Tragedies were rarely expected in the small town, so the silence of the Sanderson house did not particularly disturb anyone. Grandma Mary was growing tired. She volunteered at a local church, helping to cook for the poor, and tried to keep the house in order. Her grandchildren, she said, were too old for play, but not old enough to live on their own. She told a friend at church that she sometimes didn't understand what they whispered about in the evenings, and that they had their own world. According to police reports, it was during this period that the first open conflicts began. Several neighbors later reported hearing raised voices coming from the house, something that had never happened before. Mary was usually a strict but calm woman, while Lily and Jacob were quiet and obedient. Now harsh words were heard all the time, doors were slammed, and someone once saw Mary throw something out of her bedroom window into the backyard. In the interrogation reports, Mrs. Harper's neighbor recalled, "I went to see them one evening to bring apples from our garden. The house was strangely quiet. Lily was sitting on the sofa, Jacob was next to her, and they were holding hands. Mary was standing by the window, silent. I said hello, put the basket on the table, and left. Once outside, I thought, something is wrong. I can't explain it, but there was some kind of tension, as if the air was thick. As autumn wore on, the twins missed school more and more often. The attendance records for October 2002 show sick almost every other day. Teachers called home, but Mary always gave the same answer, cold. The doctor said to stay home. It would later turn out that there were no doctors. Lily and Jacob simply refused to go to school. They spent entire days in their room, sometimes locking themselves in and not opening the door until their grandmother knocked several times. Harper's neighbor told the police that she once heard Mary's laughter through an open window, and then Mary's sharp screams. No one knew what exactly happened then. The school psychologist's diaries contain notes about Lily. The emotional outbursts intensify. The girl is either silent or starts talking very quickly, as if making excuses. Jacob acts defensively around her, sometimes even aggressively if he is asked questions about his family. The teachers noticed that they had become almost inseparable. If they used to sit at different desks in class, now they only sat next to each other. They held hands during breaks, although this caused whispers from other students. By November 2002, the grandmother had begun to become seriously concerned. In her phone conversations with a neighbor, transcripts of which would later be included in the case file, phrases such as, "I don't understand what's happening to them," and "sometimes I feel like they don't trust me" are found. One of the incidents recorded in police reports occurred on the evening of November 12th. A neighbor from the opposite lot heard Mary yelling at Lily and Jacob. The words were hard to make out, but the man claimed he heard something like, "This can't go on like this." A few minutes later, the door slammed, and Mary ran out into the street. She sat on the porch for almost half an hour, then returned. What caused the quarrel was never determined later. The twins refused to talk about it during interrogations. There is another important episode in the case file. On November 18th, Mary came to the priest of the local church, Father Thompson. She asked to talk to the children about moral boundaries, but did not specify the details. The priest agreed, but the meeting never took place. Lily and Jacob refused to go. Social services, having received a signal from the school about frequent absences, scheduled an inspection for December, but the tragedy will unfold before the inspectors have time to arrive. The growing tension is also recorded in police reports. Neighbors increasingly heard screams and once saw Lily running out into the yard in tears, followed by Jacob. But her grandmother locked the door and did not let them back in for almost an hour. By the end of November, the situation at the Sanderson house had become so tense that several neighbors discussed calling the police, but no one did. From the outside, the house looked normal, and Mary, whenever she met someone on the street, always said that, "It's just teenagers. Everyone has hard times." Those hard times ended in December, and very soon the Sanderson home would become the scene of a crime that would make all the local newspapers. December 2002 was the month when the situation in the Sanderson house finally got out of control. The cold winter with early twilight only increased the feeling of isolation and anxiety. The house on the outskirts of town now seemed cut off from the world. Closed curtains, rare lights in the windows, the absence of the usual sound of a TV or radio. Neighbors increasingly noticed the silence, which seemed to be pressing from within. Although previously Mary's house, although not rich, lived its usual life, Mary became increasingly tired and withdrawn. She left the house less often, stopped going to church, and stopped talking to her neighbors. According to indirect evidence, it was during this period that regular conflicts began within the family. Neighbors heard screams, slamming doors, and sounds of quarrels that were previously uncharacteristic for this house. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Lily and Jacob stopped going to school. Officially, the grandmother explained their absence by illness, but it was obvious that the reason was different. By this point, Lily and Jacob had virtually stopped communicating with the outside world. They spent all their time together, locked in their room. The normal sounds of life, conversations, music, the clink of dishes, had disappeared from the house. More and more often, only snatches of quarrels could be heard in the darkness of the house, which suddenly died down, creating an atmosphere of something unfinished but dangerous. Social services scheduled an inspection of the living conditions for the end of December, as the school had reported long-term absences of students and possible problems in the family. However, the visit never took place. By the time the inspection was supposed to take place, the tragedy had already happened. According to the investigation, the tension in the house reached its limit in the first week of December. Mary increasingly tried to interfere in the lives of her grandchildren, but met resistance. They did not speak to her, ignored her requests, and could sit for hours behind a closed door. Psychologists later noted that this was a classic sign of growing conflict and a gradual breakdown in the connection between generations. Neighbors saw Mary go out into the yard and sit for long periods on the porch without turning on the light. Her figure in a dark coat against the backdrop of a house with closed windows became a familiar sight. It was the silent presence of a person who could no longer cope with what was happening inside the family. In mid-December, a turning point occurred. According to established data, on the 15th, Mary tried to get her grandchildren out of their withdrawn state, but the situation turned into a conflict. Neighbors heard loud screams, after which the house fell silent. That evening, the door of the house was found ajar, although Mary usually always locked it. The next day, December 16th, one of the neighbors reported suspicious silence to the police. The officers who arrived found Mary's body in her bedroom. An examination established that she died in the evening hours of the 15th from a blow to the head with a heavy object. The murder weapon, a bronze table lamp, was lying nearby. There were no signs of forced entry or penetration from the outside, which immediately indicated the internal nature of the conflict. The grandchildren were in their room. When the police entered, they did not resist, did not try to hide, and did not take any action. They were calm and indifferent to what was happening. This fact will later be mentioned repeatedly in reports as one of the strangest details of the case. The investigation found that after Mary's death, they spent the night in the house without telling anyone what had happened. There was untouched food in the kitchen and a light in the living room that had been on all night. It was as if time had stopped inside the house. The examination showed no attempt to stage or conceal the crime. Lily and Jacob did not try to remove traces, did not try to leave. Their behavior was assessed as either a complete lack of understanding of the consequences of what happened, or as indifference bordering on a conscious refusal to explain. Lily's diary found in her room records entries from her last weeks. These were short phrases, devoid of coherent text, but reflecting isolation and alienation, words about fear, loneliness, and an unwillingness to change anything. Psychologists would later note that the entries were in the nature of an internal report to herself rather than an attempt to explain herself to others. After Mary's body was discovered, the police began an investigation. The twins were taken into custody. Their behavior remained as distant as ever. During interrogations, they said little, avoided contact, and showed no emotion. Psychiatrists noted the absence of reactions that usually accompany such events. No aggression, no panic, no remorse. Mary's death was a shock to the small town. Newspapers published photographs of the house, reported details about the grandchildren's detention, described the family as withdrawn, but previously not suspicious. Neighbors built their own versions, recalled seeing the twins a few days before the tragedy. They were walking down the street, holding hands, looked calm, showed no signs of nervousness. By the end of December, the case had officially been designated a criminal investigation into the murder. The district attorney's office announced that a trial was in the works to examine the circumstances of the crime and the mental state of the accused. But the trial never took place. The ending of the story would be even more tragic than Mary's murder. After Mary's body was discovered, the Sanderson home was sealed. The police completed their search in 2 days, taking documents, personal belongings, Lily's diary, and school records. The twins were transferred to the county jail at the police station, awaiting the court's decision on a psychiatric evaluation. It was clear from the start that the case would be difficult. The defendants were young men with serious developmental disabilities, without lawyers, and without a clear position on what had happened. Investigators recorded that Lily and Jacob did not resist arrest, did not ask questions, and showed no emotion. During interrogations, they answered in monosyllables, sometimes remaining silent. Psychiatrists who worked with them in the first days spoke of an unusual combination of isolation and complete indifference. This complicated the collection of facts. There were no confessions, no attempts to justify themselves, not even denials. Meanwhile, the media attention only grew. Local newspapers published headlines about a family tragedy in a quiet town. TV channels came to the Sandersons' house, filmed the boarded-up windows and the deserted yard. Journalists tried to find relatives or friends of the family, but no one could explain what had happened in those last days. The investigation established a chronology of events: a quarrel on the evening of December 15th, Mary's death close to midnight, the night the twins spent in the house next to the body, the morning of December 16th, the door left ajar, the police called. Everything indicated that the murder was not planned, but the motive remained unclear. By late December, the county attorney had formally announced that he was preparing for trial. The plan was to appoint a state attorney and conduct a psychiatric evaluation. The court would decide whether Lily and Jacob were capable of understanding the nature of their actions and were responsible. In prison, they were kept separate from other prisoners. Staff noted that they did not even talk to each other, only sometimes sitting holding hands, silently, for long hours. Psychiatrists reported signs of deep depression, but refused to give a prognosis until a full examination was completed. The trial date was set for mid-January 2003. Authorities expected the case to attract the attention of the entire county, but it would never reach trial. Events would take a tragic turn even before the first testimony was heard. January 2003 began with preparations for the trial that would provide answers to all questions. The district attorney's office was gathering materials. The court had appointed a court-appointed attorney, and psychiatrists were preparing to conduct a full examination. But by this point, the situation with Lily and Jacob was becoming increasingly tense. In prison, they barely communicated with the staff, refused the priest's offers to talk, and did not answer the lawyer's questions. The staff of the detention center noted that the brother and sister spent long hours in silence, sitting next to each other, sometimes holding hands, as if locked in their own world. Guard reports from the first days of January show that Lily and Jacob stopped taking books and newspapers offered to them. They didn't watch television, weren't interested in news about their own case, and didn't respond to conversations with other prisoners. Psychiatrists described deep depression, but there were no signs of aggression or attempts at self-harm. It was as if they were simply waiting for what no one knew. Meanwhile, preparations for the trial were proceeding as usual. The district attorney announced that the case would be heard publicly, with experts and witnesses called in. Newspapers wrote about the upcoming trial, and television showed archival footage of the Sanderson home, discussing the prosecution's version of events and possible motives for the murder. On January 13th, guards noticed that Lily and Jacob had begun asking to meet together in the common exercise room. They had previously spent time in separate cells, but now, a few days before the trial, they insisted on going out together. Psychiatrists considered this a sign of emotional dependence, but did not object. The brother and sister behaved calmly and did not pose a threat to others. On the evening of January 17th, 3 days before the scheduled court hearing, Lily and Jacob spent more time in the common room than usual. Guards recorded them sitting by the window, holding hands and looking out at the street for a long time. No one heard a word. Conversation, if there was one, was quiet. After returning to their cells, they refused to eat dinner. On the morning of January 18th, the day when a group of lawyers and psychologists were supposed to visit the prison, guards noticed that the door to the roof of the administrative building was left open after repair work. As the investigation would later establish, one of the guards on duty was responsible for this, having failed to close the lock after inspecting the ventilation. Around midday, Lily and Jacob took advantage of the moment to go out onto the roof. The exact circumstances of their exit remain unclear. Security cameras only captured the moment when they were holding hands, standing at the edge of the building. None of the staff had time to intervene. They jumped together. Security guards found their bodies at the foot of the building a few minutes later. The investigation documents state that everything happened quickly and without anyone trying to stop them. Death occurred instantly. The trial, which was scheduled to begin in 3 days, was canceled. The case was closed due to the death of the accused. Interrogation reports, psychiatric reports, expert examinations, and crime scene photographs remained in the county archives. The press called it the darkest case in the county in 20 years. Newspapers wrote about the tragedy of the Sanderson family, about the isolation, and the strange behavior of the twins, which no one could fully explain. Psychiatrists spoke of a severe form of emotional dependence, prosecutors about undisclosed motives, but the answers no longer mattered. The Sandersons' house remained empty. It was sold at auction in the spring, and neighbors long remembered those winter days when the small town found itself at the center of a tragedy that was talked about far beyond its borders.